Thank you, and good morning. And I hope the elections will bring what your heart desires today. So, look, before I start, I must do a caveat emptor. I'm sort of recovering, I hope, from a very bad ear infection. I just traveled back from Japan, where I was at the G7 a committee on food security and nutrition, and we touched, amongst others, on this topic as well. So this is an area very close, I'm sure, to many people's hearts. I'm from a developing country originally, India. Grew up hearing my mother saying, clean that plate, clean that plate. You know, you're not going to get your ice cream or your dessert until I see the bottom of your plate. So, and there was much wisdom in that. So, okay, so how do I move this thing? Sorry.
Right here.
Right here, okay. All right, sorry. So if I do a few of these, you'll know, and pardon me. So my presentation is in 4 parts. I'd like to start by discussing actually the World Bank's value proposition. The World Bank, for those colleagues who are from outside, is now organized by global practices. There are 14 global practices. I represent the food and agriculture global practice, and I'm really delighted to be here to speak on their behalf. The second segment will sort of talk about the food loss and food waste challenge, and I'm sure you've all discussed this at some length yesterday, so I won't dwell too much on it, simply to say that there's a lot of data out there and a lot of information which we need to start pulling together and taking action on. The third section is on the pathways using the lenses that the World Bank's Food and Agriculture Global Practice is using. The 4 pathways, or 5 pathways if you count one of them as A and B, to reduce food loss and waste. And then the final one is on policies and programs that really are needed, and actions by the different sets of actors, whether it be government or private sector or consumers. So really we are all in it together. So let's see if I can. So, you know, many of you are familiar with our twin goals, which are eradicating extreme poverty sustainably, which means bringing down the number of people who are existing on below $1.90 a day to under 3%, if I remember correctly, by 2030. And then boosting shared prosperity, again, sustainably. So a lot of emphasis on sustainability. Now, the boosting shared prosperity relates to the bottom 40% in every country. So this is really about getting to the heart of inequities. So wherever you might be living, if you are amongst those who are not enjoying access to all the services, all the opportunities, et cetera, as the rest of the 60% of the country, then this goal seeks to help in that regard. So a couple of things to note here. We've done a number of studies to underpin our World Development Report, which is a bit dated, about 6-7 years old, if I remember, where we looked at a series of countries, and the empirical evidence demonstrates that agriculture GDP growth is 2 to 4 times more poverty reducing than non-agriculture GDP growth. And in countries in the global south, you know, there are countries where it's even 11% or more. So really, if, you know, if we are serious about reducing poverty, serious about getting the incomes, getting the services, getting the food, nutrition, et cetera, delivered to the poor, this is one sector that cannot be neglected. We also know that the world's poorest spend a good proportion of their income on food. So again, something to be mindful of. In terms of boosting shared prosperity, I think we also know that the marginalized women, people who are landless, smallholders, 500 million smallholder farmers, of which many don't have access to land or secure land tenure or finance, operating finance, or seeds, or fertilizer, what have you, they are all in that group that we need to take care of. So here's our value proposition, which is the food and agriculture global practice really is aligned with the SDGs, all the relevant SDGs, and really, as I look at the SDGs, I see so many of them, not just SDG 2 or 1 on poverty and hunger, or climate change, or water, or gender gaps. I mean, you name it, right? Agriculture touches everything. So the idea for us is very clear. We want to be able to feed everyone, every day, everywhere, with a safe, nutritious, and affordable diet. Now, I talked a little bit about the 4, or if you wish, 5 pathways, which are very clear to us. Now, these pathways are as follows, and I'll touch on these a little bit more in the next section. Climate-smart agriculture, nutrition and food quality, agribusiness and value chains, and jobs. I sort of lumped them together because 5 circles looked a bit too messy, sorry. Uh, rural and urban transition. This is a new area. It's not that it's new, it's just that we are working on it in a more systematic, thoughtful way. Because people say, oh, but aren't you focused, even at the G7, one of my colleagues from another IFI was saying, oh, but you're not worrying about the rural poor anymore. So I said, well, what happens to the food that the rural poor produce? It's going to the urban areas. So it's just 2 sides of the same coin. So let's be mindful also of the 2 billion poor who will be living in slums by 2030. The poor who are working in informal food-related sectors in the urban areas. There are, 50% of the world's population is living in urban centers today, and this is only going to go up to 70%. And I think I talked to a few colleagues from the Latin America region. In some of your countries, it's already way above the 70% mark. So this is something that we need to be mindful of. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this section because I think I don't need to tell anybody about the definitions or the scale. There's a lot of data out there, not all consistent, but all big numbers. So what we need to remember is that food loss and waste are happening everywhere. They're manifested, whether it's on farm, during processing, transport, or logistics, or food preparation, and then at our tables. I mean, yesterday my daughter bought me this big bowl of chicken soup. I mean, I'm not a fan of chicken soup, and she said, you have to have it. And I said, you could feed the whole family with this huge bowl that you got. But we are not mindful of things like that. So, I sort of had to put up with god-awful chicken soup because I didn't want to waste it. I was coming here today, so I really couldn't, and with a clear conscience, throw it away. Okay, so Now, I said that a lot of the food is wasted on both sides of the development spectrum. Now, imagine if we had all those calories available to us. By some accounts, it's, more than a quarter of the daily caloric needs of an individual that are wasted on average globally. We can also understand why the more nutritious perishables like fruits and vegetables are the ones that are more fragile and they're damaged more, and of course, meat products or dairy products also. It's food loss and waste doesn't escape any product category or any country type. And to me, it was really telling that food waste at the consumer level in the developed or global north industrialized countries is almost as high as the food production in sub-Saharan Africa. Really, that's something that should give us pause. It's a big problem, and we haven't really put our heads around it. So the orange is really the loss of or food waste at the consumer end of things. And you can see, unfortunately, Asia, where, people really are mindful of waste. And my Japanese colleague, is it Motinai? Mottainai. And it means no waste, right? Or what a waste, right? So even from that, we are moving into a situation where it's become okay to accept food loss and food waste, across the spectrum. So this is something that we need to worry about. Post-harvest, processing, distribution losses. These are things that are actually within our control. We have the technology, and we really just need to think about it. I mean, I was in Uganda several years ago, and I went to a farm, and they had a bumper crop of tomatoes, which were just rotting. And I said, why don't you just slice them up, throw a bit of salt, put them out in the sun, and you can eat these later? And it was like a revelation. I don't know if they did it because it sounded pretty alien to them, but it's simple stuff like that which doesn't get done. Now, on this slide, I just want to show that climate change and extreme weather events are starting to take a toll. In the period 2008 to 11, El Nino and La Nina reduced an estimated loss of about 25 million metric tons in major food grains per year. So, that's just one sort of episode of El Nino, La Nina during that period. So this is, these are becoming more frequent, more severe, but even where there isn't a frequent or severe impact, the gradual rise in temperatures and the impact on the biodiversity, on the water, on general productivity is something that we need to be really starting to take action on today. So this is just something that puts, all of those things together. One of the things that I'd like to, a couple of things that sort of are standing out here is that if food loss or waste was a country, it would rank third in terms of GHG emissions. So it's so severe, it's so bad. I mean, we don't even have to think about what else to do, but if this is something we can get in control, there's a way forward for us. Rapid urbanization, I touched on before. Of course, there's also the issue of a growing middle class. So we have a rising middle class, which is at the same time demanding a more diverse food basket. They are looking, some perhaps in the top tiers, income tiers globally are looking for fresh, organic food with small food miles, et cetera. Others are looking for more processed type of foods, which then have implications for nutrition. So pathways to reduce food loss and waste. These are the five pathways that I talked about. Now, again, the technology is largely there. We know that there are actions we can take to reduce the usage of water, to conserve soil, to use, drought-resistant varieties of seeds, et cetera, to prevent wastage. Now, it was something that struck me as I was doing some reading for this and for my trip to Rome and to Tokyo, that, when we throw away food, we are throwing away water, we're throwing away soil, we are throwing away the environment. So it's not just the food that is being discarded, it's all of those things which we need to survive on a day-to-day basis. Sorry about that. Now, the investments we need, again, as I said, are clear. We're working in here, a couple of examples in the box to the left-hand side. In Vietnam, we are introducing, alternate wetting and drying. We are using automated sensors for looking at canopy temperature, at the soil's moisture content, et cetera, reducing a lot of wastage, whether it's fertilizers, whether it's water, whether it's pesticides or post-harvest losses. So as we are heading towards Marrakesh, the next COP, you will remember that at the last COP in Paris, a number of countries put forward their intended nationally determined commitments towards mitigation and adaptation. And although agriculture was not a central theme, it's good to note that adaptation and mitigation were featured in a number of the submissions. So now the bank is truly, truly focused on scaling up our support, working with our partners in the environment, global practice, water, et cetera, to implement the INDC commitments. And that means, thinking about the investment plans, thinking about the financing, thinking about the science and technology that is required. So better nutrition for everyone. So this is also a big piece of the puzzle. And sorry. And as you know, we are in a situation where we have gone from the double burden of malnutrition to the triple burden of malnutrition. So it's not just hunger and micronutrient deficiencies in vitamins and minerals, but it's also obesity and non-communicable diseases, which are really sort of growing at a very rapid pace, even in the developing countries, amongst the poor. So, in the same family, I was talking to a researcher from an institute that looks at these things, and she said in the same poor family, you'll have parents who are obese and children who are really malnutrition hungry. So what's going on there? Now, the things that we need to do here are, of course, making ample food available, making food available to people who otherwise would not have access to it, people who live in food deserts. I mean, it's such a telling term. I'm in love with that term because it describes it perfectly, people who sort of, I was traveling across New Mexico and, what is it, not Arizona, but anyway, one of those states there. And I saw people coming into 7-Elevens or to gas stations, filling up, on chips, on Coke, on Coca-Cola, on things of that sort. And that was their diet. And you could see that that was their subsistence diet. And these are some things that really can be reversed. I mean, there's no excuse in a country like the United States that we have these food deserts. But anywhere, we've seen from the data that there is enough food to feed 10 billion people. We just need to make sure that it gets to the people who need the food, is accessible, and is of reasonable quality and affordable. So this is just a stylized sort of chart which lays out the activities we need to do across the spectrum, from, and sorry if you can't read it, but you're not supposed to. Anyway, you just have to take my word for it, that it's about processing, production, processing, transport, and then, getting people the awareness of what their diets should comprise, and then the sort of immediate outcomes and the more distant impact that would result. And we are very keen on nutrition sensitive agriculture. We are working with colleagues and again in health, in water, et cetera, and we screen every single new project in the food and agriculture global practice to ensure that, there is attention, analysis, and if there's a gap that the project can fill, it fills it. So agribusiness value chains and better jobs. So this is, something where we are thinking not just of on-farm production. I mean, it's really about the whole food system. Farmers producing, people processing, transporting, cold chains, retailers, restaurants, institutional purchases, and then on our tables. So this is the whole agribusiness value chain where with mindful sort of intentional actions, we can make the value chains more productive, address food loss waste across every element of the value chain through actions, whether it's at production, post-production, processing, distribution, or consumption. On the top right-hand corner is a little sort of graph that I picked up from one of the publications listed below, which really demonstrates, the corporate social responsibility in food value chains. And it was taken from the Journal of Business Ethics, and really it's not complete, but it demonstrates the critical role of the private sector in this regard. And we're working with partners in the private sector through our client governments to address some of these things. Oops. So I touched a little bit already on the rural-urban transition, and basically, this is something where there shouldn't be a discussion, at least not to my mind, because it's very clear that it's a continuum. It's not either or. It's, what you do in the rural space has knock-on effects on the urban side. The urban side, which, one of my favorite stats, and Anjali will correct me if I'm wrong, is that, spatially, the urban areas occupy 4% of the land mass, and they generate about 70% of the emissions. So, we're sort of joint at the hip, and we really need to be thinking of how the poor, how the vulnerable in the urban spaces. I mentioned those living in slums, but let's also think about the refugees, the displaced. I mean, there are 65 million people who are displaced globally today. And this has been the highest it's ever been since World War II. And they're not going away anywhere soon. The average amount of time that the displaced spend in their new home is 17 years. That's the average. Some of them never leave, right? So, because they have nowhere to go. So it is, of course, really, really tough for them, but also for the host communities. So, and mostly these are, many of them are absorbed, for instance, as we are seeing in Lebanon, or even many, many parts of Jordan. When they come out of Syria or Iraq, they are just, staying with friends or family. They're absorbed in these urban areas, in these urban spaces. So we really have to have a broad think about what's going on there, how do we address it. Now, this is a picture from Singapore. So again, no one is suggesting that we just start growing fruits and vegetables on buildings and sit under tomatoes and type our next email. But the idea is that we should not let any space go to waste. I was reading an exchange of emails between some people doing research, and they're thinking of using hospitals, which have a lot of space generally around them, particularly in developing countries, to grow food, to feed patients a nutritious and in a sustainable and nutritious way. So again, lots and lots that can be done. So this demonstrates, I think, about 215 or so research papers that IFPRI looked at for 4 products, 4 crops: sweet potatoes, cassava, mangoes, and maize in 4 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Why you see differences is because different methodologies were used. I don't know what data collection issues crept in, et cetera. But the bottom line that does not change is that if you take interventions that are timely and relevant and effective, you can reduce food loss and waste than if you just sit back. So we have evidence for that, although you would say that this is kind of understood. So, again, I'm not going to go into the details, but this just says that if we were to bring together all the actions that we've talked about, there's a role, important role for each and every actor, whether it's the government in terms of strengthening, their policies, making sure across and within sectors the policies converge and are coherent, so that, for instance, you don't have subsidies that only promote that are biased towards the production of staples and to the detriment of the soil, the environment, and of course nutrition and nutritious foods. smart incentives, procurement, institutional procurement, et cetera, and then doing a lot on the infrastructure, research, education, awareness building, data collection, et cetera. Private sector, similarly, a lot that the private sector can do by introducing even small elements for introducing efficiency in their processes, leveraging good practices, bringing innovative solutions, and of course, making sure that there are investments, and then working, reaching across the aisle, working with governments on things like, better clarity on labeling, et cetera. And then finally, consumers. I mean, we are all consumers, so we are all experts, right? So we know that we need to do our part in terms of, the portions we order, the sort of circular economy that Ted talked about before, really ensuring that everyone is mindful of what's on their plate, what's in their garbage can, how can we reduce our footprint individually. Okay, so final thoughts, I'll let you read those, but really there are different areas of focus and emphasis in low-income versus high-income countries as borne out by the data, and we simply need to work towards those. So thank you very much.